We're also looking at the 31st anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre in China. We'll talk to an activist and a UC Hastings law professor about parallels with what we're seeing in this country right now. But first, San Jose was the city where protests really started last Friday. I talked with Mayor Sam Liccardo today about some tough issues, including changes in policing, the officers seen on video taunting protesters, turning down the National Guard, and COVID-19. It's been 6 days. It feels a lot longer than that. But I want to ask you, how do you feel like your city has done so far, based on what you've seen the last few days?
Well, things have been much more peaceful in the last, certainly in the last 24 hours, and I'm really grateful. Protests have continued, of course. We've seen large crowds, but we have not seen those very few people who have been provoking reactions by throwing bottles, for example, or blowing up fireworks near officers' heads. That kind of stuff isn't happening. And as a result, there haven't been any arrests. Everything's been very peaceful, and we want that to continue. Also been heartened, more than 400 volunteers have shown up to help us clean up the debris, take off the graffiti in the early mornings, because people really recognize they don't want this protest to be lost and have the message of this protest be lost in the destruction of our city. People are really coming out to try to embrace their city.
And can you describe the people that you see volunteering, coming out to clean up the city?
You know, it's an interesting group. I can't say there's any way to characterize. I was out there a couple mornings ago, and we literally had a couple people pull over in their cars and just say, hey, I just want to jump in. One guy said he was going to work and he couldn't actually stay, so he bought everybody pizzas, which was awesome. And then, you know, we had a couple women who walked up to me and said, hey, I protested last night, and I'm just here because I really don't want people to remember this, you know, this graffiti to be associated with this righteous outrage that we feel and so many others feel.
Yeah. So no curfew tonight, right? That's been lifted, and you feel very comfortable with that?
Yeah, well, you know, we're uncomfortable with everything right now, honestly, because we know it all depends on how things turn out. You know, I'm comfortable given what we've seen in the last 24 hours is the right thing to do. Now, obviously, if we start to see widespread looting again and so forth, then we'll have to think about other measures. But it's certainly my prayer that this curfew will be behind us.
Okay. So, as you're well aware, all this started not just because of the death of George Floyd, but really we are talking about systemic racism and the way police in this country have been treating people of color, especially African Americans. As such, what kind of police review or engagement policy review is underway right now in San Jose?
Let me tell you what we're doing now and then what we will be doing. First, what we've done is just 4 days ago, a use of force report was released by an independent expert looking at all the data. And we've tried to be very transparent over the last 3 or 4 years about all the data around police stops and detentions and uses of force and so forth. The good news is we're starting to see some real progress in eliminating the disproportionate use of force against Black and brown individuals who are detained, who are arrested. And so the good news is we're seeing that dramatically drop, and we're also seeing the severity of use of force reduced. That's not to say we don't have a lot of problems. We got a lot more work to do. And the work we've got ahead, I've accepted the Obama Foundation pledge to do a full review of our use of force. I'm also going to be calling on the council to review, for example, specific policies around the use of rubber bullets around crowds. I'm very uncomfortable with, and I want to understand better why we're relying on use of rubber bullets. And I'm quite interested in banning them if it's not safe. So we're going to be delving in very deeply on some of those issues, but the longer term issue around the use of force review is coming up over the next several weeks.
Yeah, you mentioned the rubber bullets because, you know, we've seen journalists have their eyes taken out and other people at protests in other cities due to the rubber bullets, and your officers did use them on Friday along with tear gas. And there are also calls for tear gas to be, you know, ended in terms of its use immediately because of its impact also in terms of promoting COVID, with people coughing more as a result or rubbing their eyes. Is that something you've been considering along with the medical community?
Well, I'm more focused on the rubber bullets because of what the studies that I've seen have said about the potential long-term harm. The reality in terms of COVID is these protests involve hundreds, if not thousands, of people crowded together. And if people are concerned about their health, and they should be, and if they are concerned particularly that they might be particularly vulnerable to COVID, there is simply, they should not be out there if they're concerned about vulnerability, because there's going to be spread. I think we have to accept and appreciate that. So it is important for folks who feel they are vulnerable in some significant way. If they have, for example, a respiratory system, they probably should not be out there in those crowds. There are other ways for us to express ourselves, and it's simply not safe from a public health standpoint.
I want to ask you about Officer Jared Yuan. Of course, we saw him on video. I know you've seen it along with the police chief, in which it appears like he's being cavalier or sort of taunting the protesters. What kind of a review process, and have you made a decision on Officer Yuan?
Well, what Officer Yuan did was wrong, and clearly was beneath the standards of our department and our values. I don't have any role in the decision-making process around discipline. That is the nature of the city charter that our voters created. It is entirely within the police department, and I cannot intervene in that process either. But what I do know is he's been taken off the line. He's not out on the street. He's under investigation now. I expect there will be consequences, and there'll be significant consequences. But I cannot presume to know what exactly those are going to be until the investigation's done.
Can I also ask you, do you believe he was the only one on Friday night who acted in that vein, or do you think perhaps there are others? Is there an attempt to find out if there were others, perhaps, who were just not on video?
Well, certainly anyone who has information, I encourage them to call our independent police auditor. This is a separate body that's not in the chain of command of the police department that will be reviewing any cases and complaints that are brought to us. Look, we don't hire drones or machines. We hire human beings. And in some cases where those human beings step over the line, well, in all cases, if they step over the line, there are consequences and they have to be investigated. In some cases, those may be mere mistakes. In other cases, those may be sanctionable criminal offenses. Whatever the sanction might be is appropriate to, obviously, the conduct. But it's important that we encourage everyone to report every instance of misconduct. We are adamant about holding all of our officers accountable. That being said, I sat there and watched for 2 or 3 hours on Friday, and again on Saturday night. I was looking for every sign that there might be an officer stepping over the line, engaging in use of force in a way that's not appropriate. And what I saw, in my view, obviously only within the limited period of 2 or 3 hours, at a distance of 200 feet, was really an admirable amount of restraint among the hundreds of officers who were there, who were being hit with bottles, who had fireworks blowing up over their head. There was a lot going on these officers were dealing with, and to their credit, they did not react.
There was a lot going on for sure. Hey, I want to ask you about declining Governor Newsom's offer for the National Guard to be deployed in San Jose if needed. I know San Francisco did accept that offer. Other cities did. What was your thought on that?
Yeah, I don't disparage anyone for accepting the offer, and I certainly appreciate Governor Newsom offering National Guard to us. First, I believe that our department, with the assistance of other departments in the area, was able to significantly mitigate the risk of violence, although obviously we had a lot of harm and a lot of looting and so forth. But that being said, it is a very serious issue when you bring in a force that is not accountable to local community in any way, and particularly when that force may not be trained to be engaged in urban policing. This is really hard, difficult work these officers do, and every second they may make a wrong decision that may cost a life. And we saw that in Louisville, where a National Guards person shot I'm not sure it was a protester or another civilian somehow, just in the last day or two. To put people in that position, if they are not trained in a daily way and under the expectations of standards of urban policing, is a very uncertain prospect. And I simply want to ensure that we've got a police force that is accountable to our local community on our streets.
Would you have that same concern for the military being sent? Should there be any additional violence that needed additional assistance from law enforcement? I mean, as you know, the president had mentioned that as a possibility, using the Insurrection Act to activate the military for this purpose of dealing with civilians in this country. Have you given that much thought?
I believe that would be a profound mistake. It is really important that we draw a clear line in our society between policing and military action. And we don't use the military on our own people, and I feel very strongly about that.
Mayor Sam Liccardo of San Jose, thanks so much for your time. Good to see you.
Great to be with you, Kristen. Thank you.
Take care. We hope to keep the conversation going in the coming days. We will also talk more about military involvement, in particular dealing with protesters or any unrest coming up in the show. Also, we'll talk to an Oakland reverend about what we can do as a community and her thoughts on the memorial for George Floyd that just ended. Be right back.
In commercial break.
All right, let's see if we can connect with Pastor Jackie right now. Hi, Pastor Jackie.
Hi, can you hear me now?
I can. So great to see you.
Oh, you as well.
We've been wanting to do this for a long time. That's what everybody calls you, right, Pastor Jackie?
That is what they call me.
Okay. I was wondering if Jacqueline, which is so beautiful, is a little too formal. Okay, I'll go with Pastor Jackie. Did you watch the George Floyd memorial today? Any part of it?
I did watch the George Floyd. Yeah, I watched it.
The whole thing?
The whole thing.
Oh, okay, great. I'm glad you did, because I definitely want to get your thoughts on it.
Okay.
So let me go ahead and quickly update that. All right, Pastor. I'm changing all the Pastor Thompson references to Pastor Jackie.
Okay.
Okay. Great. Eric, how much time do I have with Pastor Jackie? 5.5 minutes. Okay, 5.5 minutes. All right, Facebook friends, thanks for joining us today. Really glad to have you here with us. Many of you might have watched the George Floyd memorial right here on ABC7. It was touching, it was passionate. It's hard to watch the whole thing without feeling motivated to take action yourself after we get through the collective pain. So we're going to be talking with Pastor Jackie from Allen Temple Baptist Church in Oakland, and she's going to share her thoughts with us and offer us words of healing and comfort like she does to her parishioners, but also giving us like kind of a blueprint for moving forward. All right, so 30 seconds. You ready? No pressure. I know you do this all the time. You speak in front of...
No pressure. We'll just roll with it.
Roll with it. I'll touch on COVID.
We'll see what happens.
I want to touch on COVID at the end,
Please,
too.
because we're a testing site. You know, we're a drive-through testing site.
Yep. Cool.
We are back in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5 seconds, 4, 3.
Today, we watched here on ABC7 the memorial service for George Floyd in Minneapolis. In his eulogy, Reverend Al Sharpton delivered a powerful message to the country.
Good and gracious God, merciful Master, walk with us while we run this race. Speak to us as we lift our voice. Use our hands so that they do not become fists. Change our hearts so that our rage will shift to rehabilitation.
All right, one of many voices you just heard there who spoke at the funeral or the memorial service, attended by so many, from regular folks to Floyd's family to dignitaries. Now, a Bay Area pastor was watching and listening. Pastor Jackie Thompson, senior pastor at Allen Temple Baptist Church in Oakland. Pastor Jackie, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Which speaker and what was it that he or she said resonated with you most?
Well, of course, we know Reverend Al Sharpton always was a very powerful and a very prophetic message. But honestly, I think I was most moved by the memories and the reflections of his family, the words of his brother, the words of his cousin. It was a poignant reminder that although George Floyd and his death has become symbolic and an icon for so many across the nation, and I dare say, that at the end of the day, what we lost was a human life that meant something, that had significance, a person that was loved and respected, a person for whom they were not criminalized in the eyes of others. And so I was really moved by the childhood reflections, particularly of his brothers, his cousins during that moment.
I got to ask you, one moment that I thought was so raw was civil rights attorney who's representing the family, of course, Benjamin Crump, passionately naming many of the other black victims. And he said, what we are doing is helping America be America for all Americans. How do you think we can each do that?
Well, I think one of the ways we can do it is by really being present in this moment. I personally have been pleased to see the diversity in the persons who have been protesting. In many ways, the death of George Floyd has created a storm. We have the COVID pandemic that we're dealing with, where African Americans have been disproportionately affected. We have 42 million people who are unemployed. And at a time where people really need each other and we're depending on one another, of kindness, we wit a cold and callous and I dare say evil act. And so in many ways, we see all of our systems being strained and stressed with the reality that African Americans have lived with. So we see our government being stressed and we see our healthcare system being stressed. And this is just a reminder that we have a criminal justice system that still needs to be dealt with. And so I encourage everyone first just to see what I would call the image of God in each of us. Regardless of what you believe, we are image bearers. We are humans. The second thing I would encourage people to do is find out the local issues where they are, that there are challenges. We thank God for illuminating this issue, but right where we live, whether it's Oakland, no matter where in the Bay Area, there are justice issues that need to be addressed. And now we have an opportunity to lend our voice, to lend our resources, to lend our losses that help make us better as a people. And last but certainly not least, is just to make sure we stay connected, to make sure that we realize in times of pandemic, because I think part of the coronavirus has gotten lost in a lot of this, but we are still dealing with a national health crisis, a global health crisis. And it's going to take all of us working together to make sure we come out of it safe, healthy, and whole.
I was just going to mention, I'm glad you mentioned the local angle. And, you know, after the memorial's done, the officers have been charged. What can you do? In terms of looking at Oakland, right? I know you were born and raised there, and that is where you now minister to people. What kind of changes do you think need to happen most immediately in your town?
I think change to happen most immediately. Several things I would like to see. We have an incredible police commission that has been working hard to ensure that the policies of the Oakland Police Department are what they should be. And so we have some initiatives that we hope to see coming up on the ballot, and we really need community support as well as support of the City Council on that commission, to make sure there's an voice that is looking at the issues that take place in our city. The second thing I would really love to see is we need people of faith that are willing to come out. Men are serving, they're giving food away. As you know, we are a drive-through testing site because it was important for us that people who live in East Oakland have access to testing. And so we lent our parking lot so that people would have direct access within their community. But we need people of faith to come out in front as well in support of these issues. We have an entire generation of young people who are challenged. They need a place to speak. They need voices who will speak on their behalf, and they need adults who will listen. So we need the faith community. We are challenged to come outside of our four walls, to really be present with the people that we minister to, and come up with creative partner-based solutions for the issues facing in the city. We know that it's going to be a hard time going forward, but it can't just be one entity. It can't just be the city of Oakland government. It has to be the faith community. It has to be those who are involved in politics. It has to be those who are actually residents of the city coming together with solutions that serve all of us.
Coming together is a great point, and what we're going to end on. Pastor Jackie, thank you so much for joining us today. Best of luck to you.
Thank you for having me. It's a blessing.
If you enjoy this conversation, we're going to have a lot more of it coming up right here, because ABC7 is hosting a live hour-long conversation on the issues of race today in about 45 minutes at 4 o'clock. You can watch ABC7 Listens, that's 40 minutes if you're counting, ABC7 Listens from Anger to Action, a Bay Area conversation about race, equality, and the path forward. It's a full hour of conversation with an expert panel of guests. You don't want to miss it. All right, coming up next, why we should care about the Tiananmen Square massacre in China 31 years ago and the lessons we can learn.
In commercial break.
All right, Pastor Jackie, thanks again. Great talking to you. See
Thank you
again
so much. You
soon.
too.
Yeah,
All
please
right.
come
You all
back.
do great.
Take care.
Indeed. All right. Have a great one.
All right, because that is the end of the show, or is there a break before that? All right. Hey, Facebook friends, I'm glad you're with us today. Really difficult, challenging topics today, but I hope it leaves everybody with a little bit of a takeaway. Next, we're going to talk about Tiananmen Square because that is such an eventful tragedy that happened in recent history. I know 31 years ago doesn't sound that recent. Some of you are probably watching who were not even born when it happened, but I remember it, and I remember that day as it unfolded. We were kind of in a sense of stupor, could not believe what we're seeing with our eyes. And some people have expressed that they experienced that just this week in our country, watching the unrest that's happening and the clashes between protesters and police, and going, is that us? And where is this going to go? So we're going to have that conversation next with a couple of Bay Area experts. And I see Hadar's with us already. Hello, Hadar.
Hi.
Oh, okay. We'll mention that as well. Do you want me to ad-lib that, or? No, they didn't. Okay. Do you mean Oakland or Alameda County? Because their curfew was always part of Alameda County, I thought. Okay.
Back in 20 seconds.
All right, ladies, Helen, Hadar, good to see you. We'll be on in 15 seconds.
Helen, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too,
Two
Hadar. I
intelligent,
admire
super
your work.
awesome women.
We're back in 7, 6, 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1.
This is a difficult day. We had George Floyd's memorial. Americans will still be out in the streets tonight protesting the systemic racism that led to his death. But today feels heavy for another reason. This is the 31st anniversary of another watershed event in history, the Tiananmen Square massacre in China. Students protested across China, with Tiananmen Square in Beijing being the heart and soul of it. They were out there demanding freedom and democracy. After weeks of increasing tension, on June 4th, 1989, the Chinese government used military tanks and weapons on its own people. It's estimated that 10,000 people died. Joining us to talk about the lessons of Tiananmen Square and why we should care about it here in the U.S. today are Bay Area journalist, activist Helen Zia, on the right there, and UC Hastings professor of civil law, Hadar Avaram. Good to have you both.
Great to be here.
Helen, I'm going to start with you. You see a connection, parallels, if you will, between what happened in Tiananmen Square and what's happening here in the U.S. today, especially in D.C. and New York. How so?
Well, it's striking that our president would call in the federal troops, which are designed to protect Americans against a foreign enemy, and call them in to Washington, D.C. to disrupt, attack, harm unarmed U.S. civilian protesters who are exercising their First Amendment right guaranteed by the Constitution, and instead that they should be attacked from above by Black Hawk helicopters that were deliberately swooping very low to, disrupt them, and rubber bullets that are supposed to be bounced off the ground, but instead were being shot directly at protesters. And we see around the country that this kind of state violence is happening. And it is on the, anniversary of Tiananmen Square, where that very act of power and brute force was being used against civilian, unarmed, in many cases, students who were gathered in the most symbolic, largest square in China, demanding democracy. I mean, they were standing up for democracy. Mm-hmm. And so what we see here right now, chillingly, is in the midst of this administration attacking China for all of its supposed misdeeds, and yet doing pretty much what China did during Tiananmen Square. And I think we have a lot of lessons to dissect there.
So, Hadar, this is where I want to bring you in because you study civil law here and you know a lot about constitutional law as well. Would the president be within his rights if he were to use the military and send them into cities to quell any unrest if it continues, as he had threatened earlier this week, although his own current defense secretary is backing off from it? What do you think?
So I think we should be very careful here because the answer has a lot to do not just with law, but with politics. And I really appreciated Helen's connection between China and the US precisely because of this. So the president is technically within his authority if he orders the military to do this. And it is not completely unheard of in the United States to use military power to quell civilian protests. But the very few times this has happened had all been very dark, atrocious times in US history. So it is very, very rare to do this, and it is even more rare to do this as an imposition on the states. Typically, if the states need military power to quell unrest, protests, riot, call it whatever you want, the states bring in the National Guard. So for the president to come in and override the states and essentially use the U.S. military against U.S. civilians is almost unheard of. So technically within his rights, but a very, very bad sign for all of us that it has come to this.
Look, we only have about 30 seconds. So I think, Helen, I'm going to give you the final word here in that I also see a parallel in that in Tiananmen Square, there was a lot of hope among the young people, and we see a lot of hope among young people here now. What can we do to ensure the outcome we want, the progress we want made with everyone being safe?
Well, China has a totalitarian dictatorship. The U.S. still abides by democratic law. And that's what the protesters are doing, insisting on that right. I do think, as a Chinese American, looking at the lessons from
Helen,
Tiananmen Square.
I'm sorry, I'm going to carry this conversation over to our live stream platforms. Be right back. Helen, go ahead and continue your response. We had to take it on social because we're about out of time on air. But I do want to ask you, because we want to say, what are the safeguards we have and how do we make sure we continue to have them to make sure we have the outcome that upholds democracy here?
Well, so what I was going to say is that people around the world are standing up. They did during the 1989 Tiananmen Square period to have solidarity with the protesters, and that's happening here in the United States and around the world today. And it's important to remember that you can't blame an entire country. China had a government that attacked its people. There are people in China protesting, just as this government now is blaming China for everything. There are Chinese people who are standing up and in solidarity with Americans and are not to be blamed for the virus. So in this midst, we are seeing attacks against people who are Chinese, who look Chinese, who are Americans. And so that's not going to bring us anywhere. It's the solidarity of people together that will ensure democracy and that our voices are heard.
That is an important distinction, if you will, to draw between a government that is in power and its people. Because if you were in France or Australia or the U.S., you wouldn't look at the actions of particular, let's say, our political leader, one particular elected official, to say that is the American people. Americans are like that, or Americans do that, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, Hadar, real quickly, we have about 30 seconds, but I wonder if you can quickly mention a couple of things that we can push for that would help reduce police violence.
Well, start with November. Vote, vote, vote. Register everyone you know to vote. This regime must change. It is frightening what is happening. In terms of police reform, more body cameras, more training with implicit bias. None of these things make things go away. Excellent early age education
I'll have to end it there. We need to get back together again, the three of us, and chat again another time. Take care. All right, that's going to do it for this edition of our interactive show, Getting Answers. Join us at 4 o'clock when we have our town hall on race. It's going to be an eye-opening 1-hour conversation. Take care. All right, Hadar, Helen, I'm really glad we got to talk. My apologies that we really didn't have enough time to go as in-depth as I would have liked, but I always enjoy learning from you, and I hope our viewers did as well. So let's keep the conversation going. Take care.
Thank you, Kristen.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Nice meeting you, Helen. Bye-bye.
Nice meeting you, too.
All right, thank you, Facebook friends. We had packed a lot into that half hour. We kind of ran out of time at the end there, but like I said, they were great guests and full of insight, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you tomorrow.